About a week ago, I returned to America from Japan after about 6 months. And having returned from that mission trip, I thought a lot about the country that I'm from, America, the country I'm in now, the country that I returned to, and how it's different and how I feel about that. And so, with a little bit of the free time I have before I start up my normal schedule back again, I wanted to make a quick video and talk a little bit about that. I've heard a lot of people in the past many years by this point, I suppose, talk about Christian nationalism. Talk about it being a huge problem in the country. Talk about what it is, what people think it is, I should say, and what we should do about it. I've heard talk of it in the church, talk of it outside the church, and I'd like to talk about it for a second. First of all, I don't think people really have a strong grasp at what Christian nationalism is. Not surprising, leave it to the world to not know what they're talking about. And as an extension of this, most of the talk around this subject is pointless because people don't know what they're talking about. So I would like to offer some of my thoughts and talk a little bit about JoJo along the way. So let's get into it. First, I want to identify what nationalism is, what nationalism itself is before we add any Christianity to it, so to speak. And nationalism is to identify with one's own nation and to support it even to the detriment of other nations. Now some might question, is it necessarily so bad to support your country even if another country suffers because of it? They might say context matters. It matters which country is being negatively affected by their support of their country. Is it a country run by an evil dictator, or is it just a friendly country with a democracy? Still others will argue that there is no real peaceful end goal to nationalism, that supporting your own country indefinitely against all other countries is necessarily going to lead to conflict. I'm not going to argue too much about nationalism and the philosophies behind and against it. I can do that in another video. I want to talk about Christian nationalism, which is really not all that different. Before I go on, let me just reveal some of my college experience here for a second and point out that nation, country, and state are all different things. We use them interchangeably all the time, but technically they are different. The country is the state and nation combined. The state is the government. The nation is everybody who lives within and under the protection of the state. So nationalism is all about the nation and not the state, drawing a line in the country between the nation and the state. And see, this is where it gets complicated because this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the state is genuinely awful, think Nazi Germany, and it's very important to draw a line between the nation and the state because the state's got to go. Sometimes the state isn't really the issue. People just don't want to be in the country that they're in and want to separate the nation and the state to hopefully try and get a new state to make a new country. But I believe that the nation should be congruent with the state. They're not the same and they should never be the same. On the flip side of nationalism, you have some people who think that the nation and the state should just be one. And I don't think that that should be the case. But they should be congruent. And I don't mean that in a mathematical sense. I mean that in an English sense, that they should be working together. They should be in harmony. They should be able, at least, to work together. Seems like they should just do that naturally. The state comes from the nation. Often, I guess, usually, well, sometimes states are imposed by other countries, but usually the nation is who creates the state that is above it. So, of course, that they should work in harmony with each other. But for some reason, they often don't. Again, though, that's not what this video is about. So I'm just going to, with that out of the way, I'm going to move to Christian nationalism and talk about that. If you haven't seen Inspiring Philosophy's video, which I can put in the description, he talked a lot about how, using statistics and studies showing that Christian nationalism has very little in common with Christianity, and those who identify more as nationalist tend to hold less Christian views than people who identify as just Christians and not nationalists. So then therefore Christian nationalists are more nationalist and not so much Christian. Again, to most Christians, it's not very surprising. You probably already knew that. But non-Christians don't seem to get that. If you watch the news, you'll hear that Christian nationalism is a problem that stems from Christianity, when statistically that seems to not just be the case. So what really is Christian nationalism then, if it doesn't come from Christianity? And it doesn't come from Christianity. As we'll get into throughout this video, the Bible just does not support nationalism, at least not in the way it's being expressed in America at this current point in time. And I want to quick draw a distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is just a love for your country. Nationalism is when you are supporting it above all else and against even your own state. Totally different than patriotism. Patriotism is just loving the country that you live in. Nothing to do with nationalism necessarily, although all nationalists, not even all nationalists, are patriots, to be honest. Of course, a lot of times they hate the state, which is a part of the country. So, and if I learned anything from my politics classes in college, everything's more complicated than it needs to be. But I think the problem of Christian nationalism stems ultimately from a much bigger problem we have in our world today, which is people not understanding what Christianity is and thinking they're a part of it anyway. To illustrate that point, I want to talk about JoJo's and funny Valentine, President of the United States in Steel Ball Run, and ask the question, is he a Christian nationalist? Is funny Valentine somebody who is a nationalist, but also identifies as Christian, even though he doesn't really believe the things that the typical average Christian does? Now, a Christian nationalist, unlike a normal nationalist, incorporates God into their ideas of nationalism. They might believe that God is the one who has preordained their nation to be better than others. They believe that God has specifically and specially chosen their nation. Or perhaps they just believe that God is behind them. God is for them. And so then, therefore, they can do whatever they want. Of course, I think it goes without saying that these are really hard to prove concepts. How do you show that God has specially chosen your nation? We know he did that for Israel, but there's a whole book written about that called the Bible. Do we really have any of that for America or England or Australia? I think that would be a lot harder to prove. Sure, these nations are blessed by God, incredibly so. But that doesn't mean that God has specifically chosen the nation to do something. I think rather that's evidential of God having chosen his people, the church, to do something. And a lot of those people happen to be within these countries and under these states. But Valentine doesn't really talk about God all too often, which seems odd considering his goal in Steel Ball Run, which is to collect the dead, cut up pieces of Jesus' body and use them to his own will. And this, I think you could take as very metaphorical. I don't know if this was a Rocky's plan exactly, but you could really take a lot from this. The funny Valentine, as the President of the United States, is just trying to use Jesus for his own goals of protecting the nation to the detriment of other nations. To Valentine, nationalism is his end goal, and Jesus is just a stepping stone to get there. He doesn't actually care about Jesus, obviously. He's trying to assimilate the guy. He only cares about his nation, and Jesus needs to be used in order to get his nation to a place where he wants it to be, which is above all other nations and protected. But is it so wrong to want to protect your nation, even if other nations have to suffer? No nation can be perfect and do all things, right? I think ultimately we have to be wise in these situations, be humble, and point out that one of the main themes of the Bible is sacrifice. Or it's not, protecting yourself to the detriment of others. It's sacrificing yourself for others. And you should never be forced to sacrifice yourself for others or sacrifice your things for others. But God does want you to do that. God wants you to want to do that. God wants you to know it's a good thing to sacrifice things that you want so that other people can have what they need. But again, you should never be forced to make that decision. But a nationalist does not believe that's a good thing. They believe that those within their nation should have everything that they want before we begin to discuss about what other people need. And then we get into an even more complicated question. How does anybody really know what the nation wants when a nation is full of diverse people who want different things? Ultimately, the nationalist gets to just come up with whatever that they think the nation wants and go off their own beliefs. And they think that if their nation is the best on earth, then they could give God what he wants. But again, this is just a failure to... Ultimately, a Christian nationalist just uses religion, uses Christianity in order to fulfill their nationalistic goals. And see, this isn't anything new. It's not anything unique to Christianity even. Just about every faith and religion and even mythology that's ever existed has at some point had a nation or a state try to use it just to get votes, just to get bills passed, just to legitimize their rule. A lot of political figures have used religion for their own gain. But Christianity isn't meant to be used by the state to manipulate the nation. And it's not necessarily to be used by the nation to manipulate the state. Christianity is about each individual and their relationship with God. I think you lose a lot when you try to make it about a group of people and forget about each individual's specific relationship with God within that group. Something that Christian nationalists fail to do in both their beliefs and in their goals. One of the goals of a Christian nationalist is to have their whole nation be Christian. But again, it's Christian in their own view of what Christian is, more like deism than really Christianity. If you want a country to follow Christ, you don't attack the state, you go preach to the people. You preach to the nation. But nationalists who are supporting their nation fail to stop to even try and fix the broken parts of their nation before they get into supporting it against the detriment of other countries around the world. Think of when Valentine finally gets the love train ability. And at this point, if anybody tries to hurt him or do anything bad to him, it's just redirected and shot elsewhere into the world, into a different country. Again, showing that nationalism, even Christian nationalism, ultimately devolves into prideful egotism. What they want is for their nation to be above other nations, but in reality, what they really want is for themselves to be over other nations. Valentine says that he wants all these things for his nation, but in the end goal, the only one being protected is just himself. He's the one who gets to benefit from all the power. What really does his nation get from him having the love train? Sure, Valentine could go around the world and conquer or do whatever he wants to do with the love train ability if no one could stop him. But again, he wants that ability for himself. If he really wanted it for his country, he would find a way to share that love train ability with his whole nation. And I want to dwell for a second on the metaphorical implications of Funny Valentine using dead corpse parts of Jesus for this goal. A real Christian believes that Jesus is alive, that he's risen, that he rose from the grave, that he is alive currently today, and there's no body parts scattered around. He's alive. He's around us right now. But somebody who's just using Jesus doesn't care if he's alive. In fact, don't want him to be alive, because living people are a lot harder to manipulate than dead people. So to a Christian nationalist, Jesus remains dead. They believe Jesus died for them in their sins, but they refuse to let the risen Jesus be their king. A Christian knows that the nation that they're a part of ultimately is the nation of heaven. They're a part of the church. Whatever state they're in is just an aside. It's not even that important. What is important is that they know that the head of their nation is Jesus, who supersedes whatever state that their part of the nation happens to be under. The entire idea of Christianity undermines nationalism, which is why Christian nationalism and people who believe in it tend to not have a lot of strong Christian beliefs, because the two beliefs don't work together. They have to compromise on one of them. And as I've pointed out, Christian nationalists are more nationalist than Christian. So the one that needs to be slimmed down is the Christian part. And as the Christian part of these people is slowly whittled down and important beliefs are dropped, ultimately the nation itself, or the idealized version of that nation, starts to become a god. It becomes an idol to these nationalists. They think that anything and everything must be done for the sake of the nation, or what the nation could be. They start to give devotion to the nation, which should be devotion to God. And I want to point out that nationalists, Christian nationalists, they see their country as an extension of God, as an extension of God's will in the world. They view the country as being integral to God's plan in the world. And I think that just comes from a place of viewing their country with rose-tinted glasses, seeing it as better than it is, or seeing it as more important than it is. There have been many countries in the past that have seen themselves as important to God's plan, and we don't even know about those countries anymore. The truth is, everything in a sense is important to God's plan, and everything is not important to God's plan. It's God's plan. He's the one doing it. God doesn't need anybody or anything to do his plan. He uses things, he uses nations, but America, England, France, they can all be replaced. God has the ability and the power to replace them if need be. We shouldn't see ourselves as people that God needs, but rather as people that God has chosen to do life with, even though he doesn't need us. And that extends to our nations as well. Funny Valentine as a person is someone who's very charismatic. He's very, obviously he's the president. He won an election. He's somebody who has a lot of power and conviction. He's somebody who really goes after a goal to get it done. Not just anybody could really fight to get all the corpse parts like he did. That was a hard fight, but he did it anyway. Imagine if he took all of that energy and power, all of that determination, and he put that towards advancing God's kingdom like an actual Christian would want to do, and part 7 would not be nearly like it is. It would be totally different. Because again, Christian nationalist doesn't want to expand the nation of God. They want to expand the nation on earth that they're in, which, as the Bible would say, is folly, because all earthly things are fleeting. In the Bible, we read that all things under the sun will pass away one day. That one day, after Jesus returns, everything on earth will be gone. A new earth will be created, but everything that's on earth right now will be gone. We're told that every country, every state that exists today will not exist one day in the future. No earthly kingdom is immortal, because only God's kingdom is. I like the country I live in. I think it's done a lot of great things throughout history, and I think it has the opportunity, the ability to really be something great in our world today. I think if my nation is to be specifically called by God, it has to follow God first, and it's currently not doing that. When I say that I don't really think Christian nationalism is that big of a problem, what I mean is that I don't see nationalism as that large of a problem in America. The Christian part, however, there is a problem in too many people thinking they're Christian when they're not. In America, and in the West as a whole, I think Christians have failed to properly articulate what Christianity is and what it ought to be. There's a lot of great books on the subject, but I'll summarize a lot of what I've read. But in America specifically, the gospel has been watered down to just being, there is a God, his name is Jesus, just believe that you're good. We tell people that Jesus died for us. He died for our sins, but we forget to mention that Jesus has rose again and is currently the head of a heavenly kingdom that we as his children, as the Father's children, are a part of. We give people a half gospel. We tell people what Jesus did, but we don't tell people what Jesus is doing. And this has resulted in there being people who identify as Christian nationalists. Funny Valentine, I think, fits into that category. His goal is, he's obviously a nationalist. His goal is to make his nation the best and most powerful in the world, even to the extreme detriment of other nations around the world. And he is not only willing, but is planning on using Jesus to get to the ideal nation that he wants. And the Jesus that he believes exists is one that is dead, one that he can use, one that will give him power, but one that he doesn't need to sacrifice anything for. Valentine believes in a Christ that has died for him, but refuses to trust in a Christ that is living for him. Contrast that with Johnny, who we see is spoken to directly by a living Christ a few times in the part and listens to what Jesus tells him. And I like to point out that Jesus appears to an individual, to Johnny, not to the whole nation. Because ultimately God's plan is about individuals and saving individuals. Through that, the nations can be saved as well, and we should preach to nations. There's a lot of talk about that in the Bible. But what that looks like on the ground is individuals. Because individuals matter more than whatever group that they're a part of. And our love and care for individuals should extend our love and care for our nations. It should be higher than that. I should care about the people of the world more than I care about my nation. I should still care about my nation. I should still want the people who live in my country to be treated fairly, but I should want all people around the world to be treated fairly. And I think the way that we do that is by reaching out to them through faith, giving them a chance to know who Jesus is, and along the way, serving them in whatever the way they need. Jesus calls nations to repent and individuals to be living sacrifices. And I think the more you dwell on that, the more you can see why Christian nationalism just doesn't make sense. Ultimately, Valentine failed. He tried to use a dead Jesus to give himself ultimate power, but the person who was actually listening to the risen Jesus defeated him. I want to emphasize again, there's nothing wrong with patriotism. There's nothing wrong with caring about the other people who live under the same state as you. But I want to emphasize that Christianity is not a self-help program for your nation. It's not a to-do list for making your nation better than others. It has nothing to do with that. Christianity is about bringing individuals in communion with God. And if you try to use it for a different plan than that, you will fail. I think Iraqi is pointing out something that's very true about America and a lot of places in the world today and throughout history, about leaders, political leaders, who use Christianity to legitimize their power without really caring at all about Christianity or even knowing what it is. And I want you to know whatever nation, state, country that you live in, you're important to God. And you matter to God. Whatever group you're a part of, you matter to God. You matter to God equally, just like everybody else. And you and everybody else all equally matter to God. The nationalists believe that the country must be glorified above all else. Christians believe that God must be glorified above all else. Just goes to show that everybody has a master. The only question is, who is it? Is it your nation? Is it your state? Or are you willing for it to be God? So I want to say, as I end this video, Jesus really did die. He died for you, for me. He died for all of us. But he did even more than that. Because on the third day, he rose back to life. Not just as a funny parlor trick, not just because he could. He did that for a reason. He rose for a reason. He rose because the kingdom of heaven needed a king. He rose because you need a king, someone to follow, someone to serve, someone that you can trust in forever, a king that will never stop leading you. Now, you can try to be like Valentine, cherry-picking verses like corpse parts, but if you're not serving the risen king, then you're not going to get far using the Bible for your own purposes. Some people seemingly have gotten far, all the way to the President of the United States, using Bible verses, using concepts of God. But in the end, it's all folly. The nation that they fought so hard to lead will one day pass away, and they themselves will turn to dust. But if you follow the risen king, if you're a part of the permanent kingdom, then your riches that are stored up in heaven will not pass away. Valentine has been dealt with in an infinite spin of pointlessness, but we, as Christians, get to live on in an endless, infinite kingdom with Jesus, who is alive and not dead and not scattered around North America, despite the beliefs of some fictional presidents. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you got something from that. I have so much I want to talk about, so many videos I want to make, so little time. Hopefully I can start to make some more now that my schedule has calmed down a little bit since returning from Japan. I had a great time. I'd love to talk about it sometime. I can't wait to get back to Japan. I can't wait to read more of this, and I can't wait to read more of my Bible, which I don't actually have in this room. It's in my other room, my actual room. This is not the room I sleep in. But thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you stay to watch more videos, and like and subscribe on this video if you enjoyed it. Anyway, if you did enjoy it, then, I mean, you know, yeah, thanks for watching this far, man. I don't know, that's crazy.